All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that this program is being recorded and will be available on the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum website and YouTube page shortly after this presentation. My name is Caroline McCarthy, and I am the Director of Community Engagement at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. I want to thank you so much for joining us for our virtual lecture series, Talking About Race Matters, Join the Conversation. We at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum believe that one of the most important topics throughout history and today is the topic of race, and that it is crucial to have and facilitate conversations about race, even when they can be challenging. With this in mind, we created Talking About Race Matters in 2020, which is a lecture series that explores the topic of race through different themes each season. Our goal is that this session and others will encourage people to come together and engage in a conversation that is necessary, but can sometimes feel uncomfortable. The series of Talking About Race Matters is a product 10 years in the making. Since 2015, the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum has focused on telling a complete history of our site, especially including the farmhouse's history as a site of enslavement. In 2023, as part of this investment in diving deeper into this history, the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum hired researcher Ramin Ganeshram. Ramin is a journalist and culinary historian who published The General's Cook, a novel in 2018, which tells the story of Hercules Posey, the African-American chef enslaved by George and Martha Washington, who self-emancipated in 1797. Ramin has also been the executive director of the Westport Museum for History and Culture since 2018. Ramin tirelessly searched through archives to continue our research, though this time with a focus on culinary history, colonial kitchens, and Lenape influences on cooking in the 18th century. Today, you'll hear what that research revealed. You'll also be hearing from Melissa Kiewiet, the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum Executive Director. Melissa will tell you about the implications this research has for the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum and how we plan to use it for the museum's reinterpretation plans, which begin with our basement kitchen. During this lecture, if you have any questions for the speaker, please use the Q&A feature and we will answer those questions at the end of the presentation. We would like to thank you all again for attending, as well as sincerely thank our sponsor for this season, the Ministry of Education, Culture, and Science of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, through the Dutch Culture USA Future 400 program of the Consulate General of the Netherlands in New York. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ramin and Melissa.
Thank you so much. So I think Melissa, you're controlling the slides, right? Thank you. Hi everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So I was asked by Dyckman Farmhouse to support the kitchen reinterpretation project that will be underway, that is starting to become underway by essentially trying to recreate a world of the enslaved people who likely worked in the kitchens at Dyckman Farmhouse, because that's an important distinction. It wasn't just one kitchen at this site. So essentially it was recreating world. It was worlds. It was world building. And so often in my research, what I find is that the initial instinct of sites, including the one that I work at on a daily basis, is to focus very tightly on the site itself and the individuals in that site, but to really understand what their world was like, what their daily life was like within the site, you really have to understand the larger world around them. And that is everything from current events to socio-political movements to the physical landscape, the other people who were present in the landscape, even outside of the very intimate relationship between enslaved and enslaver. So that's what I set out to do. It was myself and through different periods of time, interns that were working with Dyckman, who were tasked with different pieces of recreating the world of the people who lived in and labored in the Dyckman farmhouse, particularly working in the house, working in the kitchen. So what you see there is just sort of some images that represent a little bit kind of the varied things that we were thinking about, everything from religious life to who was coming and going literally in front of this building, while it was, part of what was actually an incredibly bustling Kingsbridge Road. It was an outward of the city, so it was rural, but it sat kind of like it does today, on a very busy road of people coming and going, down to leisure activities of those who were enslaved, and then of course the topography of the site. Next slide, please. So a big part of this was what I call separating fact from fiction. Um, so there's a number of layers to this question. Most broadly is the question of enslavement in the North. It's really important when we do this work to embed within the interpretation that comes out of the research the fact that Northern slavery was different from the South, but it wasn't better. Right? There's a fiction that it was better, it was somehow less cruel, it was less oppressive, that in some way it had a different tenor than the South. So it was different in terms of the work people did, where they lived, right? So in the North, it was more common for enslaved people to live within the household where they were enslaved. The sort of barrack system really didn't exist very much in the North. Certainly, the nature of the work could be different. In this case, this was a farm, so there was farm labor, but it was not a plantation. Dyckman Farmhouse was on a plantation. It's important to understand that. Again, not better, just different. But that difference is important in understanding the daily work of the enslaved in this site. Another aspect in terms of separating fact from fiction in this particular site and this particular project was very much centered around a person who was believed to be in the household, a woman who was a cook named Hannah. She is described in a memoir from the early 20th century by descendants of the Dyckman family. And in this memoir, she's described as a free person who was born of an enslaved, quote unquote, Indian mother. It's about a paragraph, it's not much more than that. And she really felt like she was a great person to build a story around for a lot of reasons, right? She represented the transition from enslavement to freedom. She represented both an African descendant and native descendant culture. She represented the relationship between a mother and child, a parent and child, in a system of slavery. But so what I should say, what we set out to do was to prove that Hannah existed. Could we prove that she existed? How did she come to the Dyckmans? How did she gain her freedom? Was it simply a result of gradual abolition in New York and that process? Was it because of a manumission by a Dyckman relative, Jacobus or somebody else who may have owned her? So to do that, what we started to do was we set out centering the Dyckmans and then concentric circles going out from them to not just look at the Jacobus Dyckman, whose house it was, and his immediate descendants, and the presence of potentially Hannah or somebody who could have been Hannah or her mother in probates and wills and so on. We didn't find anything that definitively proved a person named Hannah, or even specifically a female cook, was present. But we did, of course, find that there were enslaved people, including women, in the household. Not unlikely that they would, in fact, very likely they would have functioned as cooks, among other things. And so what we were able to do then is to build upon this fiction, if you will. We don't know if it's fiction, in fact, this unprovable statement at the moment of Hannah and her mother, but to use what we do know about other cooks, about enslavement in the North, and so on, for the purpose of creating a profile of a would-be person living as a cook working in this household. So separating fact from fiction is a little bit of a sensationalist title, if you will. But in fact, it really is about what can we do to prove or disprove what we would like to be true in terms of interpreting a site. It would have been a really neat little tidy package to prove Hannah and her mother and tell this amazing story within the kitchen. We couldn't do it, but we could still make use of it. And I think that's an important point. Can I have the next slide, please? So to do this, as I started to mention, what we did was cast a wide net. So again, think about the Dyckman family and the farmhouse itself as the first pebble into a pond, right? And the circle that comes out from them is the immediate family. And you know, what based on who was living in the house, based on census records, based on wills, based on descriptions of the time that were limited, and then going out from there. Immediate family in terms of siblings, right? And then cousins, people who are related to the Dyckmans by marriage. And the reason why I did this was because certainly the exchange of enslaved people as property happened within families. You have to remember that by this period of time, most of the sales or the transfer of deeds of enslaved people in New York State was it was obviously domestic. It was very much within the state itself. So that's another reason why we looked at that. We also looked at the Northeast Slavery Records Index at the City University of New York to see if there was anybody who could correlate to Hannah by name or some variation of the spelling of her name, or individuals within the household who may not have been otherwise captured. We also, when I do this work, I like to look at things that are sort of appear at first to be tangential to the course of study, and that is based on thinking about people as real people, human beings living a life. What are the things that could have touched them, right? So we looked through New York City directories, you know, to try to find a Hannah Dyckman, to try to find other people in the household who we know did a couple who were later manumitted, or who might have been able to take advantage of the gradual abolition law. So in total, we looked at 36 New York City directories up to 1850. We looked at historic newspapers, right, to see things like runaway ads, but also to understand who was doing business between the out ward of Ward 9, what is now, you know, Inwood, and Lower Manhattan, the commercial center, as well as up as far as Yonkers and parts of Westchester. And this gave us, again, that world building, who was doing business, what kind of interactions, therefore, would have enslaved workers had with people, other enslaved people, doing commercial enterprise for the people who enslaved them, as well as the world that they were forced to move through as they did their business. Maps were incredibly important as well, not just simply to understand how developed the area was, but again, the larger area. So calculating how long would it have taken by a horse cart to go down to Lower Manhattan, the commercial area of the city? How long would it have been taken by a small ship leaving the area of Tubby Hook, right? How long would that have taken? Because we need to understand what a daily work day would have been like, how much time would have been expended in doing the work and in moving around. So, you know, a lot of things that were not necessarily directly related to the site itself and the people in it became really important in terms of kind of understanding who and what and how they lived in this world. I'll give you a really good example. One of the things that I wrote about in the report that I ultimately gave the farmhouse was the fact that there was several lime kilns right around the area of the farmhouse. So for those who don't know, lime kilns were enormous operations that burned, mined lime from the area and burned it down to an ash that was used by fertilizer. incredibly toxic, incredibly smelly. The people who lived around it would have had this scent upon the air. It would have been very present in daily life. And this is part of the world building. What did it smell like? What did it sound like? Right? What was the sound of carts rolling in front of the farmhouse virtually, all day long into the night? Another thing that we used in terms of casting a wide net were travel logs of foreign visitors to this area because they wrote about who they saw and what they saw. So we understood from some of these travel logs that the indigenous people were present at the time that we were examining, living in small encampments and conducting, to some extent, heritage and cultural practices. Next slide, Melissa. So I started to talk about this a little bit. What are the sources? Some of them are the sources that we all know, that we all use: census documents, wills, probates. But as I mentioned, travel logs, New York City, Yonkers, and Westchester directories became important. Maps that showed the topography became important. Cookbooks from the period. So we're talking about a period of time that, although it is quite far removed from when the Dutch were present in New York City, the Dykmans were a Dutch descendant family. So we were using cookbooks to and research by other culinary historians to understand what were the foodways. Where were they completely intact in this period of time as Dutch foodways? Where were they remaining to be sort of English, Georgian, colonial foodways? And when was there sort of an interstitial place of both things happening at once? Obviously, memoirs, uh, letters, sort of the equivalent of oral histories of the time, were important more for the clues that they posed. Obviously, any of these things are only as reliable as their testator, and we don't know these people, so we don't know how reliable they are. But we did definitely use them as clues to other things. And also, certainly, early 20th century documentation from when the house was first remodeled into a museum, preserved into a museum, and amateur archaeological sites around Inwood became important because it gave clues as to condition of the site and also the sort of latent mythology, if you will. So there's a picture that exists from the early 20th century that refers to what was the kitchen, which is now a caretaker's cottage, as the quarters of the enslaved, and that was most certainly not true, right? So the fact is that the enslaved in northern sites like this essentially lived or slept close to their work. So the cook certainly, or the scullions, would have likely been in that kitchen, but it wasn't. It most likely was not a dedicated quarter. We know that that was the winter kitchen. Am I getting that backwards, Melissa? That was the winter kitchen, right? This, or is it the other? Yeah. Okay. Next slide, please. So then it just became, and I know Melissa's going to take over after this slide, but for me in developing this report, it wasn't simply about kind of listing, which I did. Here are all the places that we gleaned this information. Here are the citations. Here's the facts of what we found and what we didn't find, but more telling a story. Let's tell a story from the Dykmans, the people they enslaved, as I said, the physical environment. What was it like to be in this farmhouse that is, as those of us who know it, as I assume we all do, on a high point in Inwood, where with everything around it would have been essentially clear cut. What would it have been like to stand there and see the rocky outcroppings all around it, to have the breezes from the river, the cross breezes from both sides? Even today, if you are at that site on a breezy day or even a moderately breezy day, the wind kind of whips around you because of how high it is. Very simple details like that were really important into telling the story, so that when the interpretation came about, you could create a fully sensory experience. Things like, as I mentioned, the smell of the lime kiln, of animal dung, right? Both from the property and from the oxen carts and the horse carts and the donkey carts coming, moving by. The sound of people talking in the street below, for example. So, in telling the story, I kind of sectioned out this report into worlds of the enslaver and the enslaved, um, used a fair amount, as I know we all do, of period images, paintings that, of course, were not necessarily of the site, although some were, but to just give an idea. And using, again, period cookbooks and very specific examples. So, in Amelia Simmons' Book of American Cookery, widely thought to be the first American cookbook, there are recipes that were clearly of Dutch origin, who by that time, which by that time became fully inculcated into what was considered American cuisine. That was a great clue as to the kind of things that might have been cooking, being cooked there. And then for me as a culinary historian, it was really important to think about, the trade that was going on in Inwood, in Lower Manhattan, in Westchester, at large, not just the sort of inter-community trade, but the Caribbean trade, the Atlantic trade, what was coming in or available. This is where period newspapers were super useful, right? Because merchants, of course, would advertise what they had for sale and when. So that was quite helpful in helping to tell that story as well. So that's kind of like my overview. I'm going to hand it over to Melissa to talk about the really interesting stuff, like what's going to happen with this research.
Thank you. Now let's see if I can advance my own slides. Oh, whoops. All right. So we were really excited to work with Ramin on this project, but I want to back up just a minute and kind of give a brief timeline of how we've gone about researching the enslaved people at the farmhouse, because in 2015, under new leadership, this was a new initiative that was started. But at that time, our nonprofit was very tiny. We didn't have a lot of fundraising done yet. So it is something that takes some time. We were successful in a grant to the New York Community Trust in 2018. And they funded our first round of research. And until then, we were just using information that we could find in our own archives, which is not a lot. And that first round of research helped us identify some resources on some individuals who had been manumitted, like such as Francis Cujo, some who had run away. So there were ads about them, and that's how we found out their name. Will was one of those. And then, of course, we found out about Hannah, which, as Ramin said, was somebody that we know from family writings, right? And not necessarily from a census document. So we had that first round, and then we incorporated it into our programming and exhibits at the farmhouse in a bunch of different ways. And so as we move forward with wanting to reinterpret the entire site to include the narratives of everyone who lived and worked there, we were successful in getting a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services in late 2023, which is what enabled us to do this round of research. That is not to say that this is the end of the research. Research is always an ongoing project, but it does give us a lot more information to move forward with our interpretive efforts. So the first thing that we're focusing on is the basement kitchen, also known as the winter kitchen. We chose this space specifically because in what little research we had before doing this project, we knew about Hannah and her mother and that they were supposedly cooks in the kitchen. So we really had a focus on wanting to tell their story and find out more about them. And so as part of this grant, we did this research project, and now we are working with a company called Monadnock, who is going to build an exhibition in a immersive exhibition in this basement kitchen to kind of talk about what life was like for Hannah and her mother or other enslaved individuals who lived and worked in this space. Um, this is part of a larger reinterpretive effort. We're going to be doing this, like I said, around the entire house and the grounds as well. We're just starting here in the basement kitchen. And as we have moved through this project, we've realized, we don't have a lot of information about Hannah and her mom, and we couldn't definitively find those primary documents that said they were here. However, we still want to acknowledge their experience and that the family spoke of them in writing. So the way the project is working now, we're using more composites of these people using Ramin's research, where she cast a wider net of what was life like in the area, what were the sounds that were happening, what we had to choose a time frame, right? Because the family lived here in this house for almost 100 years, as it sits where it is today. And so that's a lot of time to pass, and you have to pick a particular point in time. So we've kind of narrowed down to the area around the War of 1812, which is really interesting, I think, because not a lot of places are really telling the history of that particular war. It was also a time when there were a lot more restrictions happening around the comings and goings of enslaved people, particularly Pinkster was outlawed around this time. Pinkster, and I'll talk more about that later, is a week-long celebration 7 weeks after Easter. So, so we think it'll give us a lot to talk about in this space and what will be happening. As you see the pictures of the kitchen now, it kind of looks like, the family cooked some food on the fire and sat down and enjoyed it, right? But that is not necessary. This was a working kitchen, not necessarily a space where people are sitting down and having a fine meal. That would have happened upstairs in one of the parlors. And so we're going to change the objects that are in the room. And then there will be an immersive video projection onto the wall where you will see and hear people coming in and out doing work and talking about, current events in their time. So it will be more of an immersive learning experience. And then, of course, we will also have labels and that sort of thing. The video is only going to be 3 to 4 minutes long, but obviously we want people to stay in the space and interact with it in more than one way. So we're just kind of working through that process now, and how do we tell the story? What does it look like? Who are the people who are telling the story in the film? So it's a really, really exciting project to work through, and we're hopeful to have that presented at the end of this year, so probably by November. And then, of course, as we move forward, we'll be working this into our exhibitions in other rooms. Right now, we currently have on display our Blue by Regina Evans, and she is a local artist who deals in not just the history of enslavement, but the history of the marginalization of Black people. And so we want to continue this, working with local artists who deal with the history in multiple ways. We, in the past, have had ceramic artists do installation work around this topic. We've had all kinds, so we want to continue that moving forward. And then, of course, we're going to add it into our programs. This is the part where I'll talk about Pinkster a little bit more. On the top picture is a picture of our Pinkster program that we hold every year. So Pinkster was initially a Dutch holiday celebrating the Pentecost 7 weeks after Easter. And they allowed their enslaved people to also gather with friends or family on neighboring farms and have their own celebration. So there was a crowning of a Pinkster king, lots of cultural celebration at that time. And so it's something that, because it was outlawed in the early 1800s, it was a holiday that was largely forgotten, and it was only really celebrated like in the New York City area, parts of New Jersey and Albany. So it was a very regional holiday, and it was kind of forgotten about after it was outlawed. So it's something that we've really wanted to bring back as a way to celebrate Black culture in the US, and also to remind people of this important holiday, because it was at a time where enslaved people could practice their own cultural things. And then the bottom picture, we've partnered with other organizations to do arts as advocacy, and we incorporate the history that we're learning into these types of programs. So these are things that we've done in the past, and that this work is going to inform, this research is going to inform our programs moving forward, because it gives us more things that we can build programming around. And then, of course, we are working with the Bowery Residence Committee to create the Inwood Sacred Site. This is the site of the enslaved burial ground and also a Lenape ceremonial site. The property was bought in 2020 by the Bowery Residence Committee. When they found out the history of the site after buying it, they hit pause really hard and decided that they needed to figure out what to do about this history. They didn't feel right just, building on this land. And so they held a series of community feedback sessions. They created an advisory group from all local people and cultural leaders. And we settled on creating a memorial. And so the bottom picture that you see here is part of the final design. You'll see there's there's an indoor portion where you can sit and reflect, and there's an outdoor portion with a burial mound, because there are remains that we have found in the repository of the Natural History Museum, which they have already said they will repatriate, and we will reinter on the site. So as part of our larger programming, this informs the programming that we will do for the Inwood Sacred Site as well as the Farmhouse Museum. So it's very important for that as well. And that is the end of my slides.
Okay, thank you, Ramin and Melissa. We're going to get started with the Q&A now. So if you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to use the Q&A function. But to start off, our first question is, were there any interactions between enslaved Africans and indigenous people on or around the Dyckman property?
So that's a great question. I mean, the assumption is absolutely yes, based on sort of circumstantial evidence. We did not find, I did not find any specific document that, as we know, let me just backtrack and say that when we talk about enslaved people, when we talk about African descendant history of this period of time and indigenous history, we have two problems. The first is that the historical record, what becomes the historical record, is not transcribed often by those actors themselves, right? If at all. So it's within the context of white enslavers and colonizers to write that history, should they deem it important enough, with that racialized bias, right? But even having said that, specific references outside of this memoir of, or this description of Hannah in this memoir as being the daughter of an Indian person. And I want to say that I can't quite remember, but there was some question of, are we even necessarily talking about a mother, because the word mother wasn't specifically used, right? So we did not find anything, but almost very certainly, because of the presence of the Lenape in the area, we know that there were trade relations. There are some descriptions of that between Europeans and indigenous people, and certainly therefore the enslaved people in the area, and the few free African Americans in that area would have probably also continued that kind of trade and intercultural relationship. So did we find it on paper? Did we find it in? No, but can we assume it from larger historical context? Yes, I would say yes.
Thank you. I'm going to combine a couple questions here. So this question is asking, when did the Dyckman family enslave people? Did they free them only when enslavement became fully emancipated in New York in 1827? And then as a follow-up, did any enslaved people that we know of stay on as paid help post-emancipation?
Yeah, I will. I will take that and let you bounce off of what I say, I guess, Ramin. So we were really looking at enslavement in the time period that the farmhouse is where it is now, for this particular project. Certainly they were likely enslavers long before that. The Dyckman family came here in the 1660s. They did not build this house until 1784. So there's another 100 years of them having a farmhouse just a little further north of where we are now. They did, we only know of a few, well, I think just one emancipation that, or one manumission, I should say, that happened, and that was Francis Cujo, and we don't know the reasons why. It could be that he was older and not fit to do the service that he was supposed to do. We really don't know. It could be a number of things. And yeah, I'm not sure about the gradual or the gradual emancipation.
Yeah, so I'm just like looking back at my notes here. So the question of gradual abolition really becomes important for the second part of your question. Did people stay on? The question in the census documents that we found, so census documents, of course, are tricky. Not every census document lists people by racial identity. So we can't really be sure of that. That following, 1827, did we have, in fact, were there people remaining at the site as paid employees? The implication, again, of this one sort of description of Hannah is that, in fact, she was free And it says that she was born on the place, right? That is one of the things in the description. She was born on the place to an Indian, they don't say mother, right? But essentially the Indian child of um, of an enslaved person born on the place. We assume it was her mother. In any case, that indicates that she's free, right? And so it's possible. We just don't know. We all wish that census documents remained like consistent in what they ask, but they don't. So we just don't. At this
Yeah.
moment, as Melissa said, at this moment, we don't know. We're still, and I should just say, for just the benefit of anybody who has an interest in this, there were repositories that had information that, for one reason or the other, were not available while we were doing this research. They were doing renovations. They were not. We couldn't get to them. Some of them are now available, and my plan is to continue to look through that material now that I can get to it to see if we can determine any more. Again, it's not very specific to these exact people. It's more ancillary, sort of relatives and people in the area. But hopefully we'll have an answer to that eventually.
Yeah, none of these things give you a clear, straight answer as much as we wish they did. Awesome. So we have some questions about the people that would have been working in the kitchen at the farmhouse. So beyond the cooking part of food preparation, what did you find out about food storage and food procurement? Would the enslaved people working in the kitchen have gone to markets? How did they get their food? And did they eat a lot of oysters like in Lower Manhattan?
So yeah, there were a lot of oyster beds around that part of inland. So almost certainly there is a travel log of an English traveler who is basically talked about seeing indigenous people eating oysters, and we know that certainly Europeans understood for hundreds of years by that time that the oysters were good for eating. So yeah, we're pretty much betting that they did eat a lot of oysters. In terms of what they did, what people working in the kitchen did, that I thought was really compelling was, as I said, there's two kitchens in this house, right? There's the basement kitchen or winter kitchen, and then there's the summer kitchen, which is now the caretaker's quarters. Um, and what's interesting about that to me, kind of looking at the two spaces, I realized something just from the other work that I've done, is that one was that they were both in use consistently, right? So this idea that one is summer and one is winter, and there was some kind of hard stop, didn't gel with information from other sites. So they were both in use consistently. And they were certainly production kitchens. One of them was absolutely a production kitchen because of its space. And when I say a production kitchen, basically processing things that were produced on that farm. So there were extensive orchards on this property. We know that there was a cidery, right, to press cider, apples into cider, that other people in the area brought their apples and their other fruit to be pressed at the Dyckman Farmhouse. So there would have been like a lot of production going into that process, as well as butchering and so on. So I would say to you that a majority of a good percentage, not uncommon for the time, of the food that they consumed came from the site, was stored and processed and preserved and pickled and so on. As I mentioned, Tubby Hook, it's right there. It's kind of almost around the corner, if you will. It's just a few blocks away, was where the markets were. There were public markets there. And ships were coming in right to that site and unloading material, not just from Lower Manhattan, but international material as well. The last thing I would say about the people who worked in the kitchen, I think it's important to understand that at northern sites, especially sites like this, it was highly unlikely that the people working in the kitchen were only dedicated to the kitchen. They probably were doing other work as needed. They were certainly, you probably had people who were known for their cooking, and that was the majority of their job. But at a site like this, it's very likely that they would have also functioned as people of all work, doing other things in the household and on the farm as needed.
Awesome. Thank you, Ramin. Let's see here. So we have a question about the Inwood Sacred Site and the history of the site. And, as you mentioned, we have identified remains at the American Museum of Natural History. So this person is asking if there are remains at other sites around Manhattan. And if not, maybe you could explain what we know about the history of that site and what happened to those remains.
It's a great question. So that we know of, there are no other remains at other sites around Manhattan. I will say that the history of that site that we know is, well, both Dyckman and Nagel families, who are big families up here in Inwood, used that burial ground for their enslaved people. So in the early 1900s, when the city started to encroach northward, as Ramin mentioned earlier, there were a bunch of amateur archaeologists who were coming up and digging things up and cataloging and taking photos of the things that they were digging up. And we have a lot of that stuff at the farmhouse. And during this time, they also dug up the enslaved burial ground. They dug up 34, I think it was 34 remains, and they did not treat them with any reverence. And the reason that we were able to find things at the Museum of Natural History is because the archaeologist who did this actually made note that a quote unquote scientist took some of these remains for his studies, and he was at the Museum of Natural History at that time. And so through our partnership with BRC and a consultant that they hired, the consultant was able to go to the Museum of Natural History and say, hey, we think you have these remains. And then they were able to go through a repatriation process, and they are caring for these remains in the meantime until we get the site prepared. And so we've been trying to raise awareness of the site since, well, really since 2015, but definitely in 2018. I think it was 2018, maybe 2019. We have everything before the pandemic is a blur. But there was a press conference that we held with local elected officials about the site. And we had worked with the school that is right next door, PS 98, and erected a plaque there to talk about the site, because the site was at that time an auto body shop and then a school parking lot, because all of the remains had been dug up and the city just built on top of it. And so it's from the writings of that archaeologist that we knew about it, and we were trying to raise awareness of the site. And it just happened that BRC bought the building, and it was the perfect point to actually move forward with the plans to build a memorial there.
Awesome. Thank you. So I just got a few more questions for you guys. So Ramin, you talked about kind of building this world in Upper Manhattan while you were doing this research. So this person is asking that in regard to local economies, did you come across any references to the Bluebell Tavern, a colonial inn located near today's 181st Street? Also, have you come across the name Abraham Stuyvesant, a freeborn Black man buried at a nearby cemetery?
Yes to both, right? So the Bluebell Tavern, quite famous. We had hoped to find references to other taverns in the area. There was a tavern owned by Jacobus Dyckman's brother at the Kingsbridge, which was very bustling, very busy. And so that was something that we also thought about. Actually, it wasn't at the King's Bridge, it was at the Dyckman Bridge on the other side, I believe. So, but yes, Bluebell Tavern was very well known. We had hoped that we could find more information in terms of records, account books, sort of letters, memoirs about the Bluebell Tavern to potentially place more people of African descent there. Unfortunately, we could not. But yes, very, very much. In terms of Abraham Stuyvesant, only passing reference. Again, not I wasn't focused on that. So I can't tell you that there isn't definitive information about him. I wasn't really looking at that. One thing I do want to say, and it's not exactly related to this question, but it is related to topography and things in the area. And it's that I think that what I often say when doing this research is that it's important to look at sources that you've seen before again and try to sort of task yourself to look at it in a new way. There is a map. It's actually a copy of it is hanging in the farmhouse in the gift shop. And it shows Ward 9 and it shows the Dyckman orchards. And I've seen it many times. A lot of people have seen it many times and never really thought about it. But then I looked at it again and superimposed it on a current map of New York, and kind of thinking about the topography. And it made me realize that the Dyckman orchards did not only sit exactly around the house, they also sat on the other side of what today is the 225th Street Bridge. The Broadway Bridge at 225th Street, which is a significant bridge. But back in those days, before the creek was dredged and became sort of a deeper water channel, it was nothing but a trickle and a stream, and there was a small wooden footbridge there. And so the enslaved at the Dyckman Farmhouse, as well as paid farm workers, were not only harvesting right around the farmhouse, they were walking up to 225th Street, and they were crossing this little bridge to get to the orchards on the other side, right? So I just bring that up to say that it's really important to look twice and three times at things. And that goes for Bluebell Tavern and Mr. Abraham Stuyvesant as well. But I just want to say that before I forgot. There's some good images of Bluebell Tavern. For those who are interested in this little tavern, there's some good line drawings of it out there, which are of course great to look at.
Awesome. Thank you, Ramin. Please excuse the sirens going by in the background if you can hear them. So awesome. So I think a good question to end on is something that has already been discussed a bit in this presentation. But as a former site of enslavement, how does the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum address anti-Black racism in its community?
That is a really great question. I think through programs like this, 100%, and through making sure that we're telling the full story and addressing questions as they come to us through visitation, people who come and have questions, and because we are telling the whole story, being able to have that full conversation with people. Even one little bit of factual historical information can really make the difference in someone's outlook on things. So really, it's through our programming, through our outreach, and just talking with visitors on a daily basis.
Great. All right. So thank you again to both Ramin and Melissa for this fantastic discussion. I hope all of our attendees enjoyed this talk, and we hope to see you at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum in the future, and especially to see how this research changes our space in the coming years. You can join us here next week on Zoom for the second presentation of our series titled The Harlem African Burial Ground, History Beneath Our Feet, can learn more and register for that talk, both through the link in the chat and on our website, dyckmanfarmhouse.org. We also encourage you to consider making a donation to the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum to allow us to continue to offer free public programming like this one. Gifts in any amount are sincerely appreciated. Thank you again, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.